Hello and welcome to another video tutorial for TazMcCarthy.com, this time on Photoshop and Photoshop rendering. So far you've learned in class how to render with hand markers, and you can work out how to make an object 3D by adding highlights, shadows and midtones. Photoshop can be used to achieve this in much the same way. We have a range of brush tools and colors we can use just like markers, but you need a few tricks to be able to do it really well. So we're going to go through some basics in this video and then go into some of the techniques and some of the other ones. First thing to understand in Photoshop is that everything is made up of layers. Consider these like pieces of paper on a table. If I add a new layer here over the top of the other one, whatever I draw in this layer, which is selected because the blue is around it, is independent to what was on the previous layer. This also works for moving objects around. Therefore, anything in your drawing which you think is distinctly different should be kept on a different layer. If you were to resize something, change the color, change the shape, or want to start that part again, you won't have to do the rest of the drawing again, the whole thing. Some examples of the type of thing we're trying to achieve can be seen with these. This drawing started as a sketch, and then each of these surfaces was brushed using the tool that you just saw until this effect was built up. And you notice there's lots of little details and things like that to add some realism, but for now we're just going to worry about basic shapes. Here's another example. This one is made up of many different layers, but they all go together to make the car as you can see it here. This one is a much simpler one, brushing in the different shapes and some basic shadows and highlights to make it appear 3D. This one fairly simple as well, with an image off the internet pasted in for the screen before some reflections brushed over the top. Here is an even simpler one, showing the type of thing that could be done from a sketch just like this. When we're brushing, of course, it's very difficult to brush between the lines, and we don't really want to go back later on and have to try and erase back close to that line. So it's very important to firstly learn about selections. We've got a range of selection tools up the top here. The simplest one is the marquee tool, which just drags a box. Then you'll see when I try to paint that it's constrained inside that box. That's the basics of how a selection works. It's quite like covering over everything that you don't want to paint in newspaper or something like that to leave that perfect edge. Other types of selections are elliptical marquees. Our next type is the lasso tool, and most commonly people will use the middle one. Polygonal lasso tool works by going from dot to dot, and depending on what you're doing, you might like to zoom right in and select bit by bit. When you get back to the end, click on the starting point to make a loop, and again it works in exactly the same way. So you can start to see in this drawing, but by doing some different selections, that you could fairly easily start to brush in some different colors, exactly like you would if they were markers. Starting to make things look 3D. The trouble with this method is we don't want to have to make selections every time we want to work on something new. So coming back over this side, making a new selection, we'll lose this one, and if we want to work on it again and reselect it, it's going to be very hard to line it up exactly the same. You'll see the little white gap here, so it's not going to look very good. There's a way that we can save our selections that makes it perfect for this type of rendering. Once we're happy with the selection, we make sure we have a new layer here. If we need to, we click the new layer button, and then we come down and click on add layer mask. All of a sudden you'll see, back to our analogy with the newspaper being covered, that in our little preview down here, all of the black represents what's coloured and the white is what's not coloured. Which means now if we go to paint on this, despite not seeing a selection and it painting actually all over the screen, it's only going to show us what's in this little box here. If I set up a second one for this part of the scope on another layer, I can now work on this side and then click back to work on this side, and it's a simple click back and forth. When you're working on something like this is going to have many sections and layers, as you can see down the side. Notice that I've named each of them. You don't want to rely on the little thumbnail preview when you're selecting them. You want to be able to read what it is, understand it, click, and be working on each area. So here we might call it the right end, and this one the left end. Some other selection tools that you might find handy are the magic wand tool. One way to select this middle section before we paint would be click point by point around it with a lasso tool, which will be very accurate, but it'll take a very long time. Sometimes you can't avoid that, but there is a quicker way. By clicking the magic wand tool, it looks for whole sections of one color. Simply click once in the middle. A little bit tricky here, we need to make sure we're clicking on the layer that we're trying to select, and then it will select that section. Make a new layer, we'll call it the center round, and add the mask. Zoom back out, and we're ready to paint. Ready to paint on this area. Just like so, to build up some contour. So you can see at the start of your drawing, after having taken a photo or scanning in your sketch, the first thing you should really do is go through and select each section using these various tools, and then turn them into layer masks. After that, you'll be ready to start painting. A couple of little shortcuts to help you when navigating Photoshop. The first is Control or Command on a Mac, plus and minus to zoom in and out. To get everything to fit, it's Command or Control 0, and it'll fit everything on the page. Once you are zoomed in, to save having to go to the scroll bars here, by holding spacebar, it'll let you click and drag to pan the screen around. A couple of little shortcuts with selection tools. Firstly, we can do selections in more than one part. Up here we have add, subtract, and difference buttons. If I set it to add, it'll let me add more and more sections. So I had a big area that I wanted to select and then subtract other bits. We can also achieve that by setting it to subtract, and it will cut away that. If we want to do a new one, back to here. Command D on a Mac or Control D on a PC will deselect something quickly, and Control A on a PC or Command A on a Mac will select everything instantly. This should save you quite a bit of time as you navigate around the drawing.